Welcome back to CBS News 24/7 Primetime. I'm Juliette Goodrich. We're following breaking news. President Trump has announced that he would suspend attacks on Iran for 2 weeks. This came after Pakistan's prime minister asked him to extend the previous deadline, which was set for 8 o'clock Eastern tonight. Now, President Trump made the announcement on social media, writing, quote, "This will be a double-sided ceasefire. The reason for doing so is that we have already met and exceeded all military objectives and are very far along with a definitive agreement concerning long-term peace with Iran." Earlier, President Trump had warned on Truth Social, quote, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will." All right, CBS News senior foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab is live in Doha, Qatar. So thanks for joining us. If a ceasefire is agreed, as the president has said, then what are we hearing from Iranians tonight?
Juliette, well, as you can imagine, there is a huge sigh of relief being heard all across the region. We're here in Doha, Qatar, of course, one of the countries that has been targeted in Iran's retaliatory strikes over the past 6 weeks. This, of course, is a country which has one of the largest LNG plants in the world. That's liquefied natural gas, providing around 20% of the world's fuel. And there are so many countries across this region who are so invested in this. But the reality is from the Iranian perspective, they have made it very clear throughout this war that they would not accept a ceasefire of any kind. What they would accept was a full end to the war. And yet we have this 2-week ceasefire. And it is a delicate one, it has to be said. But to answer your question as to what could have been the reason for the Iranians accepting this 2-week pause, if you will, it's down to the fact that President Trump has also reiterated this key point, that he is acknowledged and is willing to negotiate on the basis of a 10-point plan that the Iranians have put out. I'm going to read some of those points to you just to get us an idea of what the Iranians are essentially asking for and what they hope this deal will ultimately lead to. And that is a permanent end to hostilities and guarantees that the fighting would never start again, a lifting of all sanctions on Iran, and that the Strait of Hormuz, this body of water which has been so hotly contested throughout this conflict, this tiny narrow strip of water in which 20% of the world's energy passes through, that Iran will exact a toll of $2 million per vessel passing through. They will split that money with Oman, in which is a neighboring country that they share that body of water with, and keep $1 million for every single ship that passes through. Money they say they will use as a form of reparations for the damage caused to their country throughout this war. And finally, what I'll also add is that they want to make it clear that the war that we haven't been talking a huge amount about, which is the fact that Israel has been targeting Lebanon, which is where Iran's proxy Hezbollah is based, that the fighting there will stop and other proxies across the region will stop being targeted as well. It is a pretty maximalist list of demands from the Iranians, and they believe that the U.S. is taking those demands seriously, and that is why we have this now 2-week ceasefire, which is now only a few minutes old. Julia.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to ask you from your perspective. So with this looming deadline of 8 p.m. in the United States, Eastern time, what was the reaction and the generic or the overall pause of relief that you saw from civilians there?
Look, throughout the day, we've actually been seeing images coming out of Tehran, which is actually quite difficult to do. We have to remember that the Iranian leadership has imposed one of the most punishing internet blackouts in the world. For nearly 6 weeks, Iran has effectively had very little internet, which meant we could get very little information from the country, not least hearing from people inside. And yet we did see images of supporters of Iran doing exactly what the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, called them to do. He said 14 million Iranians were prepared to put their bodies on the line to defend the critical infrastructure that President Trump said he was going to destroy. In that early morning Truth Social post in which he said the civilization would die, that of course being Iran. Many people in Iran seeing that as a direct threat to them as a people and as a nation. And while many Iranians certainly do not like their leadership, some would go as far as saying they actively hate their leadership, that they love their country and they wanted to defend their country. So again, while we are seeing this sigh of relief, not least here in the Gulf and indeed inside Iran and frankly around the world, as many countries understand that a protracted, brutal war with Iran is very bad for the rest of the world, that this ceasefire is now in place. The question now is how durable it's going to be and whether it's going to lead to a lasting peace.
Yes.
Julia.
This 2 weeks is very crucial. Anything can happen for sure. Do we know who in Iran is doing the negotiating?
Yeah, we have to remember that throughout this war, many senior leaders in Iran have been killed. In fact, in the early hours of the war, the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed. This was a man who ruled Iran for 36 years, and then we later saw his son become his replacement, Mujtaba Khamenei, a man we haven't seen since he was announced as the new supreme leader. We've only heard seen some statements from him on state TV. But the Iranians have a leadership structure which is decentralized. They call it the mosaic. And essentially what that means is that they were preparing for a major conflict which would see their senior leadership killed. And so what that meant was that when one leader was killed, there was literally one rank below ready to rise up. And then below that, another one ready to rise up. And so we understand that the Iranian president was deeply involved in these talks. We understand the Iranian foreign minister was deeply involved in this talk, and indeed members who are tied to the IRGC. Pakistan, of course, we need to mention they were really acting as the go-between between Washington and Tehran. Why Pakistan, you might ask? We have to remember this is a country that shares a border with Iran. It has cordial relationships with Iran, but crucially, it does not host a U.S. military base like these Gulf countries do, which have been on the receiving end of Iranian drones and missiles. But I think what's also important to add is that over the past year, Pakistan and Washington have become incredibly close. President Trump, in his Truth Social statement announcing this ceasefire, acknowledged not only the Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, but also the Field Marshal, which is the most senior military person in Pakistan. Many see him as the de facto leader, Asim Munir, as helping to negotiate this. And it really just underscores how it required a country that was able to talk to Iran and was able to talk to the U.S., was seen as relatively neutral, was able to at least get us to this point. We've also heard from the Iranian leadership acknowledging Pakistan's role in all of this, but we want to keep reiterating this key point here, Julia. Even though we were fearing that a major escalation could have happened right around now, that this ceasefire, which is now in place for the next 2 weeks, so these negotiations can continue, remains quite fragile. Julia.
I want to ask you this. I do know that you spent time recently along the Strait of Hormuz. So what assurances can we get that we can trust that Iran doesn't have any mines in the strait and that they will give safe passage?
At this stage, we only have Iran's word for it, just like the Iranians only have the U.S.'s word that this ceasefire will hold. And we have to essentially see, the proof in the pudding. Will ships pass through? Will vessels not be on the receiving end of any kind of obstruction or harm, whether it's mines or anything to that effect? Now, it has to be said that although the Strait of Hormuz has largely been bottlenecked, a number of ships have been allowed to pass through. Iran has given permission for vessels to cross. So the fear of mines at this moment seems to be relatively small, but the reality is that this vital choke point, this waterway, which is so vital to the world's energy supply, 20% of the world's energy supply passes through this narrow point, Iran on one side, Oman on the other, that has to be open. And that is crucial to this. It underpins everything President Trump has been demanding from Iran. It all revolves around the Strait of Hormuz, and it seems like the strait should be open, but we'll have to see over the next days and potentially weeks to see if that holds and whether these talks can actually bear fruit and we see an end to this now 6-week war. Juliet.
Imtiaz Tyab live in Doha, Qatar. Imtiaz, thank you for your reporting. I want to bring in CBS News Middle East contributor Courtney Kealy with more on the ceasefire and what more we're hearing about this. Obviously, talks are continuing and we have a 2-week period, but anything can happen in that time.
Well, what I'm really hearing with is a unique relationship with Pakistan that has with the U.S., but they also have a unique relationship with Iran. So it was really the Pakistanis that drove this, not just the prime minister, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff essentially is the field marshal, and he was the one who has a good relationship with President Trump, and J.D. Vance, the vice president, was involved. So, but while I was working and hearing sources coming through Pakistan and what they were able to effort, I was also talking to people that are in touch with Iranian officials, and they really have the will to end this war. What they were pointing out to me, what the Iranians see this as, is first of all, the Speaker of Parliament, the National Security Council, and people like the president remain in power. So while the regime might be down, it's not gone. And they can still hold on to that. They won't necessarily get into talks about nuclear or ballistic missiles or anything like that right now. But I am hearing from those sources that are speaking to the Iranian regime officials that the Strait of Hormuz will open. And it's this one particular part of the Strait of Hormuz that was really the most difficult, was this almost just about 2 miles. It's its narrowest point that are Iranian territorial waters. So we don't expect to see them actually putting some kind of toll booth in there, or some way that you can't pass through without paying the Iranians for that. Now, all of this has to be worked out or not. It's a ceasefire. People are saying that the Iranians are feeling, and people close to Iranians and a family that are telling me that there's relief and worry. But the waterway is supposed to be open, that the Iranians want that. The Iranian regime wants the ceasefire to work. Will they actually get to talks about things that often the U.S. and the Iranians talk about, as they have over nuclear, over ballistic missiles? We're not going to see that necessarily anytime soon. It's just a cessation of bombings, really, and not escalating them at this point. And then we'll see as we move forward. But experts tell me that they don't think the Iranians are going to get into really nitty-gritty talks. It's the way they treat their own people, what the people in Iran are going to have to be subjected to with this regime still in place. And then they have all these regional kind of sub-franchises in this mosaic too, where in different provinces, across all the provinces, they have IRGC affiliated groups that can carry out their own they can be independent of central government and also carry out arrests or do other things in the name of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, but not necessarily having to get their marching orders from Tehran. So the big fear is what will happen, what kind of repression, will the internet get turned on or not? Are people still have to live in this news blackout, and how to get the economy on track? How will people have no more electrical cuts? How will they deal after these bombings? Will the Iranian regime unleash funds that they have for the revolution, but they don't usually offer up to the Bazaris that started the strikes in January, the people that marched also in January? How are they going to commerce, really basic issues they're going to have to deal with before they get to the bigger issues of a longer term kind of peace, first with the U.S. and then with Israel, because Pakistan doesn't recognize Israel as a country. So Pakistan will not be brokering any kind of negotiations with Israel. That also is something that we'll have to wait and see how that's going to get done.
And as President Trump agrees to suspend the bombing of Iran for 2 weeks, we really see it as a cooling off period. But I do hear from Imtiaz Tyab's reporting and from yours that the Iranian regime was calling it a victory. And that's where they're standing on this right now in terms of a 10-point plan that the U.S. is going to comply with. And all along, we're just doing a cooling off period.
They're going to claim victory, but also this is the regime claiming victory. They want a cessation of the war. They want to be able to get back to ruling and suppressing their people. We're also going to be seeing some interesting things this week that you should look out for, because these are images that might come out. So while you saw people holding hands around a power plant, those are regime loyalists. They do not represent the vast majority of the population, but they represent people that believe in the cause of this extreme ideology, this extreme repression of people. They believe it, they'll go out, or sometimes they're sort of paid actors to be frank, they go out, they have a meal, they believe in the revolution, and they'll do this too. Not paid actors is a wrong term, so just strike that from what I'm saying.
Okay.
But also what's happening this week later on Thursday is something called the Arba'in. It means 40th in Arabic. And the 40th day of mourning is a very significant day. And the Iranian regime will be mourning the death of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And they'll be mourning the deaths of the schoolgirls, with that mistaken strike on the girls' school that happened on the first day of the war. So the first day of the war and all those deaths will be commemorated by the regime, and we're probably going to see an outpouring of the most faithful and loyal to this extreme regime coming out on the streets, going to grave sites. That will be the next thing that happens. I don't know if they'll stay quiet, but Arba'in is a really important day for them. And so we'll be seeing that too. And that's something to watch for.
Courtney Kealy. Courtney, thank you. Let's bring in now CBS News national security analyst MacLean. Aaron, under the ceasefire, President Trump says Iran agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So do Iran and the U.S. have the same definition of opening the strait?
That's an outstanding question. And I'll be honest with you, sitting here as this news starts to roll out this evening, I have more questions than I have answers. The way traffic moved through the Strait of Hormuz before this war was that there was a shipping channel essentially right down the middle, right between Oman and Iran, basically equidistant. It was treated in effect as international waters. Ships could go through it without getting approval from anybody. They just had to obey what in effect were traffic regulations. The Iranian foreign minister's statement announcing essentially that Iran was agreeing to President Trump's own offer of a ceasefire contingent on their opening of the strait said that fine, they'll open the strait so long as vessels moving through the strait coordinate with the Iranian military and accept that they're subject to certain technical requirements. I don't know what technical requirements means. It's a pretty vague phrase. So your question is one of the main questions of the evening, I think. What does America actually define as opening the strait? And so you have these short-term questions about the nature of the ceasefire itself before you even get to some of the excellent long-term questions about the coming negotiations about a potential longer-term settlement that our correspondent Imtiaz was speaking to just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, so our understanding is Iran wants ships passing through the strait to coordinate with its military. So the big question is, will the U.S. accept that requirement, and what would that coordination even look like?
That's right. You know, and frankly, I mean, there's two aspects that I think are important. One, are ships allowed to go back to that international channel, or do they need to stick up along the Iranian coast, which would be a flex of Iranian authority if so? But two, does Iran have veto power? Can Iran say, no, you don't get to go through? It seems to me implicitly in the structure of what the foreign minister is saying that you need to coordinate with them, that they do. Because, for example, they could say no to anyone who fails to coordinate with them at all, or even to their satisfaction, however they want to define it. That seems pretty problematic to me. So we have to see how the United States responds to that, reacts to that, let alone to the demands that appear to be the beginning of Iran's bargaining positions. One of the ones that our correspondent read off to us that struck my ear was the suggestion that Iran is going to be collecting substantial amounts of revenue as tolls as ships move through the strait in a permanent and ongoing basis. I can't imagine the United States signing off on that. The president likes to cite this old joke about Iran that it's never won a war nor lost a negotiation. It's a bit of an overstatement in both cases. Not that I'm going to accuse President Trump of occasionally overstating things. But there's a kernel of truth to it as well. They are savvy negotiators, and it is very challenging to sit across the table from them. They drive a very hard bargain, as you can see, I think, here in the very opening moments of this affair, where they say the strait is open and instantaneously start to redefine what open actually means.
So as we sit here and we wait, and we know that talks are going on in negotiations, and there's a 2-week cooling off period, if you will, what does happen to oil prices and gas prices?
I expect that just in the sort of rush of general good feeling as a consequence of this deal, you'll see some positive movement in the short run. But that's the only prediction I feel confident making. The truth is there's a shock built into the system right now. We've had a month of really restricted traffic, heavily restricted traffic through this body of water through which 20% of energy traffic moves, but also 10% of all global commerce. So it's not totally clear what the effect of that shock will be as it kind of radiates out into global markets. but it's also not clear how fast we're going to get back to traffic being up and running. There were over 100 ships a day running through that strait before the start of these hostilities and the start of Iran striking at ships out in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. It's not going to be like flipping a switch and going back to it overnight. So I hesitate to predict the effects and the days and weeks to come in these markets. I don't think it's a clear route back to happy days, even though I think it's safe to say there'll probably be some relatively short-term good cheer.
Yeah, some choppy waters ahead. MacLean, Aaron, thank you.